Welcome back. This is our second part of our unit on gangs and juvenile delinquency. In the previous video lecture, we looked at gangs and some of the kind of quest for identity that's involved with gangs for adolescents. In this one, we're going to look more about the intersection of juvenile delinquency and crime, meaning that youth violence, levels of property crime by adolescents. And we're also going to look at some of the things that are kind of tied into whether this is an increasing or decreasing problem over the recent decades. So let's start taking a look at some of these questions. But first, let's take a look at our roadmap. The first one is that we're going to look at the connection between adolescence and crime. If you look at the share of total crime for society as a whole, adolescents, meaning people usually aged between 15 and 25, tend to have 3 to 4 times the level of criminality by arrest statistics compared to the general population. So there seems to be at least more people being arrested. Whether that means they're more criminal or whether that is some other cause is still a question. But the point is that there seems to be a connection between the level of crime and this particular age cohort, age bracket. Secondly, it's a question of whether juvenile delinquency is a growing problem or not. If you talk to some people, you would think that juvenile delinquency was always on the rise. The current young generation is always somehow worse than the preceding generation in terms of not following rules, not obeying the law, not working hard, and other things of that sort. More particularly in recent years, the level of school shootings has made people wonder that the kids are not all right and have seen juvenile delinquency as a growing problem. However, there's other statistics suggesting that if you look at total numbers in terms of victimization by juveniles, but also by the number of juveniles arrested, the problems of youth violence and serious crime by juveniles seems to be on a decrease now over 2 decades long. And the last one, we're going to look specifically at school violence as a growing problem. One element of this is the increasing number and also fatalities from school shootings, particularly in the last 5 years. But also the problem of youth violence, and particularly how safe children are in schools, is a bigger picture once you look beyond just the school shootings. So there's certainly a greater concern today. Anyone who is older and experienced going to school in 2 or 3 decades prior knows that schools are a lot more, let's say, locked down. There's a police presence in schools. There are metal detectors on the entrance of some schools in certain urban areas. There is certainly more drills, active shooter drills and things of that sort. There are certainly several high-profile shootings at schools, starting with Columbine in the 1990s, but crescendoing kind of in the mid-2010s. So that there's a big concern about that, and that certainly is a growing problem, and people certainly feel less safe than they did in the past. I can remember our own school buildings and basically all entrances being open, very little being locked, multiple points of entry, no key cards, and now it's very difficult even for people who have legitimate purpose in the school to enter a building. And so the point about it is that there's certainly lots of steps being taken, and there's one level we want to applaud the levels, all the preparations that are going on, but the question is have things changed, or are people just more afraid? And this is a general problem in criminology between the actual level of crime and what criminologists sometimes call the fear of crime. And sometimes they can go in different directions, and that fear of crime is a problem even if the level of crime is not commensurately high, because fear of crime affects your psychological state, and that can impinge upon, let's say, the quality of life. But particularly in schools, that I think older people can remember going to school and not being afraid that there might be a school shooting that particular day, and certainly that has changed for the current generation of students. So let's look at kind of some statistics just to frame up what the problem of juvenile delinquency is. So adolescents make up about 10% of the population, which means that every multiple of 10 in terms of total percentages in the shares of, let's say, the arrests made for different crimes suggests kind of a multiple. So if adolescents make up 10% of the population, but 40% of the murder arrests, that means that adolescents are being arrested at 4 times the rate that the general population is being arrested for that crime category. So let's look at some of these just in terms of different categories of crime. So they make up 10% of the population, but 30% of the rest. That indicates that they have a 3 times higher level of criminality than the general population, both older and younger. They make up 40% of the murder and non-negligent manslaughter, which means that negligent manslaughter are things where you killed someone, but it was through negligence, not through reckless behavior. Adolescents make up 4 times that. They make up 4 times the amount of robberies, one of the major categories of property crime. They make up a little more than 3 times more for weapons possession, 3 times more for vandalism, and over 3 times, between 3 and 4 times more for drug abuse violations. All these would indicate that there's a much higher level of intersection with the criminal justice system for adolescents than for the general population. And even if I'm sure if we were looked at, let's say, traffic and moving violations, this number might be even higher multiple than 3 or 4 times more. Another way to look at this is just in terms of incarceration, which is that young adults, generally people who would not have been put into adult prisons in the past, now make up 1 out of every 5 of the admissions in adult and state and federal prisons. Which is much higher level than it would have been in the past. But probably more disturbing, and this is cut into the issue of racial profiling, that black adolescent males are nearly 40% of the young adults that are admitted to federal prisons, meaning they're 40% of the 21%. And that is a much larger, let's say, that's a much larger share than they make up their population, both among adolescents, but also the population as a whole. And so we see not only just arrests, but also incarceration, which means they are found guilty and they are sentenced to jail or prison time. Another probably thing that's very disturbing about this, particularly about those that are sent to prison, is that there's what's called recidivism, which means the rate that people who are enter the criminal justice system, that are charged, arrested, found guilty, sentenced to prison, how likely are they to be repeat offenders? So recidivism is just basically something that means the recidivism rate is a rate that they reoffend, that they mean they're going to be arrested in a relatively short period of time. And for juveniles, you see a very, very high recidivism rate, which means that for people arrested under 25, about 3/4 of them, after they're released from prison, are going to be rearrested within 3 years, and almost 5/6 of them, 84%, are going to be rearrested within 5 years of being released from prison, which indicates that prison is not doing very much to improve, let's say, it is not, in a sense, deterring crime among juveniles. It is not, in a sense, taking them off the street. It's not, in a sense, making them contrite or sorry for their crimes. And it's not, in a sense, getting them, and there's a lot of reasons for this. One reason why recidivism happens is that once you've been arrested and you have, let's say, a criminal record, it becomes harder to get a job. It is harder to find a rental apartment. A lot of things become harder, and this leads to kind of falling back into crime. And when that happens, that you don't make that transition from childhood to adulthood, and you have an adult criminal record, it's a lot harder to get established in those early 20s, and as a result, you see a very high rate of recidivism, and that makes people worried about that. What's happening with juvenile delinquency is that once they enter the criminal justice system, they're not really getting out. And some people have talked about this as school to prison pipeline, that students who are doing poorly in school, students that are being expelled or suspended, tend to have a much higher rate of being imprisoned, and once they're in prison, basically starting to become more the pattern of career criminals because of the lack of alternatives for them at this age. So it seems that juvenile delinquency is a relatively serious problem, and that it's a larger disproportionate share of the amount of crime relative to the. However, what you can see here is that there's still clearly a decline in the level of juvenile delinquency and crime over the last 2 or 3 decades. So while that juveniles make up a greater share relative to their numbers in the population of the amount of arrests made, this is not necessarily a growing problem over time. So this is part of a general kind of trend in societies that crime has declined since the early 1990s, geographically all around the country. You've seen it in all different types of crimes, and you've seen it in all different types of age brackets. But basically, juveniles have not been an exception to this trend. So what you see is that there's a relatively high level of violent crime committed by teenagers up through from 1980 to the 1990s, kind of a peak in 92, 93. And as someone who was in high school at that time, this you know meets my own experience of what was going on. A lot of this is associated with the crack cocaine epidemic of the late 80s, early 90s, and the gang violence and some other violence surrounding the use of drugs during that period. And for a variety of different reasons, what you're seeing since the early 90s is a pretty clear trend of decline in the number of serious violent crimes committed by teenagers, going from about 1,100 to about 200 over about a quarter century. And not only is it a decline, it's a pretty clear decline, which means is that it's not kind of a noisy pattern going up and down, up and down. What you see is pretty much a consistent downward trend in the level of violent crime, which means that juveniles might make up more of the criminals and make more of the arrest in the total population. But this is not an increasing problem relative to juveniles of previous generations. It seems that teenagers are committing less crime than they did before. And even if you want to specify this a little differently, if you want to look at serious crimes like felonies, or if you want to look at the incarceration rate, the number that are arrested and imprisoned, this also shows clear signs of decline over the last, let's say, 20, 30 years. And so it's not a growing problem. Now, some people have attributed this trend. Famously, economist Stephen Levitt has looked at the impact of abortion and the Roe versus Wade decision on levels of crime in the 1980s and 1990s. And he made the argument that places that legalized abortion had smaller generations and therefore less adolescents 15 to 20 years later. So, for example, if you assume Roe versus Wade was passed in 1973, you add 15 years to that, that would be 1988. And that's consistent to kind of, let's say, the increase in crime, and then the subsequent decrease in crime is from adolescents, let's say, the large generation of adolescents prior to Roe versus Wade legalized abortion. And once that generation gets smaller, there's fewer adolescents, and fewer adolescents produces fewer crimes. And generally, that's been a finding that the size of the adolescent population, particularly adolescent male population, is a pretty good predictor of the level of crime in various societies. There is some research more recently suggesting, looking at the similar, as kind of a similar setup of the experiment, found that in the United Kingdom that the same pattern did not hold. But it does suggest that there might be something about being in adolescence that makes someone criminal, but it is not necessarily a feature of their environment, society, and that, as I'll discuss later, that most adolescents seem to mature out of criminality, which means as they grow older, they stop being part of the criminal justice system to be replaced by another generation of adolescents, but they don't continue being criminal for the rest of their adult lives. So what are the interpretations of what's going on with juvenile delinquency? The first one is that adolescents are just more criminal than the general population. This kind of fits into this idea of teenage rebellion. They're rebelling against authority. They're relatively poor. They have relatively few resources and a lot of wants, and that tends to be a situation that might be creative pressure for more crime. And we'll talk a little bit later, they might have lower impulse control. They might be more emotional. They might be more likely to lash out. And as a result, maybe it's not surprising, given all these things, that adolescents are more criminal than the general population. And therefore, what these statistics represent is just the higher levels of criminality or criminal behavior by adolescent individuals. And obviously, no one stays an adolescent forever. And as a result, that this maybe is a temporary stage, but indicative of what adolescents are. The second way to interpret this is that adolescents are just easier to arrest. They're generally not a sympathetic population, which means that my experience is that when the police arrest teenagers, their parents tend to support the police more than oppose the police, which means that parents tend to think that their children lack discipline or need to learn a lesson, and as a result, they don't necessarily always question when the police make arrests of their children. On top of that is that teenagers and adolescents in general are not sympathetic population. They tend to be self-centered. They tend to reject some of the norms in other parts of society. And not surprisingly, it is easier for agents of law enforcement to make arrests of adolescents. So for example, when you see the police pull over teenagers driving in a car, having a party, doing things that adults do, but are not necessarily sanctioned as much. Adolescents are just easier to arrest, and as a result, police will more likely arrest them than, in a sense, give them a warning or to deal with like their behavior through a different path or different channel. And this makes adolescents a targeted population, and I'm sure most particularly teenage drivers, feel this way. They feel like they get pulled over much more than drivers in general, even when they're driving in their minds the same way that everyone else is driving on the roads. The third thing is that, the take-home message on number 2 is that maybe that adolescents are not any more criminal than other people, but they get arrested more. And therefore, there's kind of, in a sense, of an age profiling going on, that when police officers see adolescents conducting behavior, they think the proper response is to arrest them, and therefore they end up, let's say, higher in the arrest rates than other parts of the population. Third is that adolescents get caught more often, which means that they might be doing the same things, they might be breaking the same rules, but they don't have the savvy or the experience to get away with it, which means that they get caught more often, which means they're not committing more acts of deviance or delinquency, they're just getting caught when they do. And this can happen from doing stupid things, not knowing the time and place, and things that adults, learn through experience and time. And so what we're seeing in terms of the numbers is not necessarily more deviance or delinquency. We're just seeing people who are doing it in a way that makes them easier to arrest. And the take-home message here is that adolescents tend to be dumb and unaware of other people, and as a result, they don't seem to understand how they're being portrayed. And where this comes most often in terms of drivers, for me as an adult driver, it's very easy to know who is a teenager driving on the road by how they're driving. They stand out, the way they accelerate, even not necessarily fast drivers, but nervous drivers. And they tend to take risks that most adult drivers do not take. So it's very easy for me to basically spot an adolescent driver even before I see who's driving the car. But adolescents in their own mind think that they're driving normally. But the point is that they're very conspicuous, and they're also conspicuous to law enforcement, so they get caught more often. Same thing with holding parties or loud music, things of that sort. They don't really always understand the social norms, and therefore they tend to get caught more often. And lastly, and this kind of is consistent with some of the things we've covered previously about the adolescent brain, is that there is a generalized, because of the brain's development, there's a lack of impulse control. There's a lack of empathy, and sometimes a lack of a sense of right and wrong, or one that's still developing. Something that we talked a little bit about when we talked about moral development as well, and that adolescents might not have an adult, let's say, mindset to be able to avoid things. So where an adult might want to commit an act or take something that's not theirs, generally they have the impulse control to stop themselves or not to engage in a criminal act. Adults are more likely to have empathy and understand like how a potential criminal act might affect other people, and therefore are going to forbear and not engage in it. And they might have just a better sense of just right and wrong, where the sense of right and wrong by most teenagers and adolescents is maybe kind of on a lower level if you're looking at how Piaget and Kohlberg describe the stages of moral development. So what is a profile of a juvenile delinquent? Generally, what you see is very low levels, and what sets them apart from other adolescents who are not engaged in criminal activity, and let me just repeat, the percentage of all total adolescents that are juvenile delinquents or are involved in violent crime is a very, very small percentage. Most adolescents are not, but if we look at how the ones who are arrested or get involved with the criminal justice system in a variety of different ways, how are they different than their peers? And one of the key things, I think, is that really low levels of social and economic participation, which means that they tend to be high school dropouts, which means they're not engaged in productive, whether it's pursuing further education or training. They also tend not just to not have education, but they also tend not to be engaged in work. So they're not employed or they're partially employed. And so whether it's because they have time on their hands or whether they've chosen a different path, the basic profile of a juvenile delinquent is someone that is not engaged in society or engaged in any structured behavior. As a result, one of the often proposed ways of dealing with juvenile delinquency is to create more outlets for social participation or social engagement or job training or something of that along those lines. Uh, Juvenile delinquents are heavily more likely to be male than female. Another key aspect of this is that they tend to mature out of delinquency, which means that most juvenile delinquents are not like adult career criminals, which means that as they grow up, the likelihood of the same people to keep committing criminal acts at the same rate does not carry through. So the idea is that if someone is engaging in criminal acts as a 14, 15, 16-year-old, it does not indicate that this is going to be their pattern for life. And I think this is a key understanding in terms of how we sentence and how we respond to criminal acts by teenagers, whether we understand it as a phase or whether we understand it as behavior that needs to be deterred early so it doesn't continue later. For the most part, most people who are juvenile delinquents will mature out of it. They're not the profile of a career criminal. Lastly, it tends to be late adolescence, young adulthood. So ages 17 to 20 tend to be where most of the juvenile delinquents are. Obviously, there are ones that are younger and ones that are older, but the core, let's say, age group, it tends to be 17, 20. So it'll be late high school, early college years that tend to be the most juvenile delinquents. So let's talk a little bit about how juvenile delinquency has been treated by the law. And for most of our history, starting in 1899, they set up the first juvenile courts. The United States was early on this, and we were kind of a model for the rest of the world. And juvenile delinquency was not seen as something criminal. It was seen as a disease that needed to be cured, which means that juveniles did not have the ability to make decisions. And remember, this is a time where many juveniles were in the workforce, were employed, were not in school, but there was still an understanding in society that they did not have the rationality or they did not have the mental ability to control themselves in the same way, and therefore should not be culpable or subject to the same punishment for the same acts. And so treating it as a disease, not a crime, led to dealing with these cases, even if they were the same crimes as the adult offenders, is dealing with them in juvenile and family courts, which usually meant that their records were suppressed, which means that it did not become part of your permanent record. And the goal of it was not to punish, which means not to determine guilt and sentence, but to rehabilitate. And very often the way that juvenile and family courts work is the idea of like what is best for the child, not simply what the act was done wrong. And so they're less about evidencing a crime, but than understanding the offender. And the United States was very lenient in the sense, like very understanding, had most juveniles going through the juvenile system, not the adult system, and this was the model of the world for most of the 20th century. What happened around 1970, there was a rise in crime, starting in the late 1960s through the 1980s, and this led to a series of actions, both at the state and federal level, that led to the criminalization of juveniles. So what you start to see is more diversion, which means juveniles are being tried in adult courts and then later sentenced in adult courts. Many states lowered the maximum age that you could be tried in a juvenile or family court. So usually it's 15, 16, or 17. New York actually has a relatively lower maximum age that you can be that you can have a choice to be tried in juvenile court. And these led to a series of changes, mostly with the idea of getting tough on crime. What you also saw is much harsher penalties, which means requiring people to serve prison time, requiring them to be in adult prison, not going to rehabilitation, not special school situations, and several things that culturally were going around. One is this notion in the early 1990s that there was this idea of a juvenile super predator, which means that they were kind of like wired in their brains to be predatory on civilized society, that the juveniles were mutating into some like horrible virus that was preying upon other people. This was a term that was used. And one of the incidents, and I think it's important to say that all the members of this have been exonerated by DNA evidence. The Central Park Five, which was alleged to be 5 young people who attacked a female jogger in Central Park. And it was a very high-profile case, and basically was illustrating this idea that kids are out of control, and they needed to be treated like adults because the consequences of their actions were that serious. And this went in with the whole idea of criminalizing juvenile behavior that previously was seen as something that had to be rehabilitated and did require support for the offender, not necessarily for punishment. And really, we're still in that phase where I think that we are criminalizing juveniles more and more. And it doesn't just happen in the United States, it has happened in most countries in the world where they are more likely to treat juvenile delinquency as adult criminal behavior, both in terms of how it goes to the criminal justice system, but also how it is penalized in the prison system. So the last thing is that from about 2000, 2005 to the present, there have been a series of Supreme Court cases, and I list them here. I'm just going to talk about generally what the findings were, which is that they put limits on the punishment, which means Roper versus Simmons and Graham versus Florida basically said that you can't impose capital punishment or life without parole on a juvenile. It violates notions of cruel and unusual punishment, that if someone is not ready to make the types of decisions, they can't be held as responsible for the consequence of their actions in the same way that adults have. And there's other things about taking age into consideration when sentencing, which was not necessarily that. There have been cases that have appealed this. But the most important, they have not, in a sense, changed the drift toward criminalization, which means that you still have juveniles being treated in the adult system. What has been taken off the table for the most part is how it's sentenced, which means that you cannot impose capital punishment, life without parole, and you can take age into a consideration when sentencing. But this really kind of softens an overall process. It is still true that the parallel juvenile justice system to the adult justice system has gotten smaller and weaker over time, while the adult justice system has become larger in dealing with cases of juvenile delinquency. So one of the last topics we're going to talk about is school violence, and this is something, obviously we're a high school, and we all have done active shooter drills, we all have done lockdown drills and sheltered in places, and this has become something that is common and would not have been common for previous generations, even though, as you saw in a previous graph, levels of youth violence were much higher in the past than they are today. So the first thing that is just looking at the number of events, which means if we look at the number of mass shootings from the mid-1960s to the present, what we see is kind of a flat trend well into the 1990s, maybe some increase in the late 1980s and early 1990s, but not a clear upward trend. And as in the past 20 years, what we've seen is kind of an exponential growth in the number of incidents. So some of these are very familiar to you: Columbine High School, Virginia Tech shooting, Newtown, the shooting in Aurora, Colorado, which is the shooting in the movie theater, and other shootings in Charleston and Chattanooga. So the number of incidents, which means this is just a number of events, not the number of people killed, shows an increase. But one way to look at this is that look at the y-axis here. We're going from something like 0 to 5 to something around maybe 30 to 40 a year. So, we're not talking about one per day, or even, we're talking nationwide, we're talking about one every 4 days, which is still a relatively small number, which means most schools are unlikely to experience this, but there doesn't seem to be an upward trend, but that upward trend is really in the past decade. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is this graph on the right, and this kind of shows two different things. One is fatalities, and the other one is the number of incidents. So the graph we have on the left shows you the number of incidents, and if you look at that, the red bars on the graph on the right, it's hard to see an increase on that scale, right? You obviously, there's some more in recent times than previously, but there's not a clear upward trend in terms of the numbers. What you do see a clear upward trend is the fatalities, the number of people dying in these shootings, which means that it is not just simply that there are more shootings, it's more that more people are being killed in these shootings, which means that an event like Columbine killed fewer people than more recent, let's say, school shootings. So in the past, there might have been 5 or 10. Now you're seeing numbers like 30, 40, and 50 being killed. And so this might not indicate the number of events, which means it's not really about the individuals, meaning like it only takes one one juvenile delinquent to engage in a school shooting. So the point is that might not actually be changing. There might be roughly the same number of individuals willing to engage in some of these acts of violence. But what has changed is the types of weapons that they have. So in the past, before 1990, there would have been an assault weapon. Before 2000, there would have been an assault weapon ban, and some of the more destructive weapons that are out there today are available. I think also there's part of this is the growth of the internet, which means the ability to research and the ability to understand and access more destructive weapons, not just guns, but bombs and other types of things that people have used, has certainly gone up over time, which means that it might not be much more probable that you're likely to be involved in a school shooting, but if you are, you're much more likely to end up dead because the power of the weapons being used is much greater than they would have been in the past. So what this is kind of suggesting is that it might not be just simply dealing with the issues of the individuals, the individual juveniles, and trying to understand what their motivations are and their situations. A lot of this might be just we live in a more violent society where people have a lot more firepower than they would have in the past, whether legally or illegally. But what that does is that makes these types of incidents a lot more likely to be fatal and to be much more lethal than they would have been in the past and much more higher body counts. Now, the other side to this is that when you look at youth violence in total numbers of cases, which means you're looking at school shootings, you're looking at gang violence, you're looking at violence committed by juveniles, it's pretty clear that the trend is down over time. So even though while school shootings are going up, when you look at all violent crimes, which means assault, robbery, rape, aggravated assault, murder, there's a pretty clear downward trend from the 1990s to the present. You saw this in a previous graph, but here's looking at a variety of different types of crimes, and you see pretty much the same downward trend. So crime victimization is usually something that's not based upon arrest statistics, so it's not really based upon the policies of various law enforcement agencies. They are sample surveys where they ask people, like, have you been a victim of a certain crime? And then they kind of generalize that to the population as a whole. So it's a way of kind of, let's say, getting to what the real number is. And the result of most of the victimization surveys is showing a clear downward trend. Sort of related is that as dramatic and destructive and the school shootings have been, they are not the most common location for homicide, whether for juveniles or for the general population. You're much more likely to be killed at home. You're much more likely to be killed on the streets than you are in a school building. Now, part of that is because all the measures that have been taken to make schools safer have had some effect, but also because schools are generally clustered environments with lots of witnesses. A lot of people who are intent on committing homicide do not actually do them in some of these public places. So schools are not necessarily less safe, although I think there's certainly a greater fear of safety, a fear of violence by students, by parents, and by teachers. The statistics suggest that all things considered, they're a relatively safe location. I think that though the expectation is, and partly because schools are compulsory, that schools be 100% safe. And so that any violence in schools is considered unacceptable. Now, the point about this is that there might have been a lot more violence in the past, but it might not have been kind of the high profile or the things that would led to nationwide media stories. There might have been gang violence. There might have been violence walking on the way to school. There might have been just kind of violence without weapons in the past, and they were handled as internal disciplinary affairs, i.e. they went to the principal and maybe they got reported to the police, but they didn't really get out, and they weren't, let's say, media stories. And as a result, they're kind of below the general public awareness. While the school shootings are obviously something that becomes very well known as soon as they happen. So some concluding thoughts. Juvenile delinquency is a declining problem. I think it's fair to say that even though that they make up a high proportion, I think a lot of that has to do with what we already know about adolescent psychology, the lack of impulse control, the lower levels of empathy, and sometimes maybe a truncated sense of right and wrong compared to adults. And as a result, that this is kind of a natural phase, and it doesn't indicate anything going forward in terms of these juveniles as adults. and it's something that can be treated as, you know, a growing stage or a disease, or as something that we need to talk about rehabilitation rather than punishment. But there's also some very concerning trends about level of school violence, particularly school shootings. And you know, these are things that I think that reflect that things are different. That when you look at the motivations for school shooters, when you look at some of the things that they are talking about, there clearly is a core of a problem there, but it might be separate from the general problem of juvenile delinquency, which is larger and decline, and therefore covers up, let's say, you know, even though school shootings might be increasing, the total number of like violent acts by juveniles, which means things that are not necessarily fatal or lethal or homicides, things like robberies or assaults or fights or things of that sort, those seem to be going down, and that's a positive. I think, a positive sign. But the more general problem of you know, are the kids all right? Generally, they seem to be doing better. But there are, let's say, very identifiable problems that need attention to specific issues behind them. And we'll try to talk about some of them. Just as a concluding note, our next unit is going to be on drugs and substance abuse. And that's one reason why, even under the topics of gangs and juvenile delinquency, I really kind of skirted and not really address that issue, because we're going to deal a lot more with that going forward. That's all for now, and I will see you later with the next unit on drug and substance abuse.